Hello and thank you for joining me today at the ICMI 2020. I'm Robert S. Wells, the founder and director of Domestic Abuse Business Support Limited, better known as DABS, the home of the Bridging the Gap project. I'm a published author, a business mentor, passionate public speaker, a military police veteran, and of course a survivor of female perpetrated domestic abuse. Now, I certainly never thought that I could become a victim of domestic abuse. However, I now know that we're all at risk from this terrible crime, as are the businesses that employ us. I was deliberately targeted at work by my abuser. As a result, I've got a detailed understanding of the traumatic effect this can have on an individual in the workplace, and of course on the workplace itself. That's why I created DABS, to help to support and protect employees regardless of their gender, sexual orientation, disability, ethnicity or social and workplace position. And of course, the businesses they work for against the very real threat of domestic abuse in the workplace. When I decided to step forward to help others that were going through what I'd been through, and I entered the debate that surrounds domestic abuse, it became very clear that it's a world riddled with bias, prejudice, discrimination and hypocrisy. The language that I regularly see and hear used is incredibly adversarial, promoting discord, bitterness, rage and often hatred. Tragically, there seems to be an all-pervasive suspicion of male victims and an obvious willingness to overlook female perpetrators. I feel that this is lodged deep within the domestic abuse system, based on the perverse notion that male victims, by virtue of their masculinity, are unfeeling brutes incapable of being impacted as seriously as women by domestic abuse. The truth is that many male victims and their children are being destroyed by a system based on these outdated social stereotypes. Male victims are often left feeling criminalised, worthless, belittled, powerless and irrelevant. Currently, domestic abuse is seen by the majority of governments and other national and international organisations as an issue that exclusively affects women and girls. Male victims tend to get a brief mention at some point in a debate, but their experiences are often immediately minimised with comments such as relatively small numbers of men experience abuse to a lesser degree. Or worse, men are only mentioned when discussing the need for perpetrator programs. This, of course, is a flagrant prejudice, clear discrimination and bias. Men are not all violent and abusive thugs, and women absolutely do perpetrate domestic abuse. And each time that a government minister stands up to talk about domestic abuse, or a new campaign is launched, a new law introduced, or another media article published that only recognises women and girls as victims of domestic abuse, it sends out a very loud and clear message to male victims that they're invisible and that nobody cares about them. Of course, it also increases their and their children's level of isolation and despair. Now, let's be clear, I favour no gender over another, and I'm not attempting to deny the statistics or diminish the experiences of women and girls. I have two beautiful daughters, a granddaughter and an amazing partner. So I fully support all efforts to protect women and girls, but it must not be to the detriment of male victims and their children, which is currently the case. Men make up a significant 1/3 of victims, not a relatively small number of victims, as we often hear repeated, with 786,000 reported cases in 2019. We should also remember that men are widely recognised as being 3 times less likely than women to report their abuse. There's no doubt that this figure is just the tip of the iceberg, but it's more complicated than simply describing sufferers and survivors as men and women. We need to understand that each case of domestic abuse is unique to the individual. However, while society now embraces and supports women, I believe that we're looking at the societal abuse of men and male victims of domestic abuse. men are now being further victimised by society's attitudes towards them. Societal abuse is a form of active abuse that refers to the disadvantages that an individual or group experiences as a result of unjust social structures. In this case, of course, the group that I'm referring to is abused men, particularly gay, straight, bisexual and trans male victims of domestic abuse, and let's not forget their children. All categories of societal abuse involve the manipulative control of time, energy, focus and connection between people, groups and organisations in the service of one side and to the disservice of another. This can be seen in all areas of domestic abuse, with all of our government's time, energy and focus being on female victims of domestic abuse. If you need written evidence of this, you just need to look at the Violence Against Women and Girls strategy. But what is an unjust social structure? Well, they're inequalities deeply woven into the very fabric of society. They can be observed across institutions such as legal, educational, business, government and healthcare systems. It's the process by which an individual is dealt with unfairly by a system of harm in ways that the person cannot protect themselves against, cannot deal with, cannot break out of or mobilise against, cannot seek justice for, cannot redress, avoid and cannot reverse and cannot change. Examples of this are everywhere. It's deeply woven into society that men are only perpetrators while women are the only victims. Examples of societal abuse include sexism, racism and other forms of oppression that grant variable human worth to individuals based on misconceptions about race or ethnic culture, gender, sexual orientation, age, disability, socio-economic background or other status. Manifestations of societal abuse against male domestic abuse victims range from overt or covert discrimination, such as inadequate funding for support services, inadequate social policies to protect against abuses, and negative images and stereotypes in the media. On both the individual and group level, societal abuse also tends to include the denial of a victim's pain and suffering, as well as blaming them for abuses committed against them. We can see good examples of this with a couple of quotes. Here's one. Layla Moran, a UK government minister, was wrong to hit a partner, but domestic violence by women is not the same as domestic violence by men. And that's from a lady called Yasmin Brown, who is a journalist. And next, women's violence towards men is frequently defensive or retaliatory. And that came from Sandra Hawley, CBE, Chief Executive at Refuge. Societal abuse of male victims is perpetuated by a society which embraces the negative gender stereotype that men are the perpetrators and women are the victims. Of course, this is an idea that's driven by the multi-million-pound industry of domestic abuse charities that support women. This is achieved through its dominance of domestic abuse funding and government influence. These groups minimise men's experiences and exclude male victims from the conversation because it suits them financially. Women's groups and feminist MPs such as Jess Phillips compound the problem by influencing parliamentary debates such as the Domestic Abuse Bill, where groups supporting male victims and their children were completely excluded from taking part, despite requests to attend. Societal abuse is traumatic to the people who are targeted and can result in stress symptoms caused by struggling with social oppression and marginalisation. Psychological effects may include depression, anxiety, shame, rage, and of course PTSD. Marginalised groups tend to be disproportionately affected by suicide and homelessness, not because they have a greater rate of pathology, but because discrimination often keeps them from receiving the same benefits enjoyed by female sufferers and survivors of domestic abuse. So, is it a coincidence that those disproportionately affected by homelessness and suicide are in fact men? Male suicide rates in England and Wales have now reached a 20-year high, and that is from the data at the ONS. Men accounted for 3/4 of suicide deaths registered in 2019, and the ONS stated that that equates to 4,303 men and 1,388 women. In 2019, rough sleeper figures show that 83% of rough sleepers were men and just 17% were women. Now, one person that's had a huge influence on both domestic abuse policy and homelessness policy at governmental level is a lady called Polly Neate, CBE, who is the former chief executive at Women's Aid and now the chief executive of Shelter. This is what she thinks about domestic abuse against men. And I quote, "We know that the domestic abuse women experience as victims is far more dangerous and severe than that experienced by male victims." Well, Polly Neate, try telling that to the individuals being abused and murdered by their partners. Now, internalized depression occurs when people absorb society's attitudes towards their group and direct those negative attitudes towards themselves. Marginalised groups such as the BAM community have fought discrimination for years, and we still have a long way to go. But in a decent civilised country in the 21st century, the majority of people recognise and support the fact that members of the BAM communities should be treated equally and should never be discriminated against. No person is superior or inferior simply because of their skin colour, and it should be exactly the same for gender when we look to support sufferers and survivors of domestic abuse. Now, let me tell you of my personal experiences. It was a typically wet, cold and gloomy day in Scotland, but I was a very happy man. I was at home with my partner and my beautiful baby daughter Sophie, who is now a couple of months old. It had been 17 years since my first daughter was born, so I never expected to be a dad again, but I was loving every single minute of it. It had been a very long, hard journey to reach this point, but I finally thought that I could relax and enjoy life. It felt as though all of the struggles leading up to this point had truly been worth it. But of course, when things are going well, life has a bad habit of testing your character, and today was going to change all of our lives forever. Suddenly, Sophie started to choke. Now, if you've ever dealt with a choking child, as I'm sure many of you watching this will have done, you'll know that it's a truly terrifying experience, especially when that child is your own. Sophie was gasping for breath. My partner was hysterical, screaming and running around the kitchen with Sophie in her arms. I asked her to hand Sophie over because I was first aid trained and had some idea of what to do. As I struggled to clear Sophie's airway, out of nowhere I was struck on the side of my face with a hard object, almost knocking me to the ground. I staggered to the side and instinctively pulled Sophie closer to me just as I was hit again. I quickly realised that not for the first time I was being attacked by my partner, Sophie's mother. The punches just kept coming, and I was now bent over using my body to shield Sophie while still trying to clear her airway. When Sophie's mother had fallen pregnant, the attacks and abuse that had been going on for years suddenly stopped, literally overnight, and I hadn't been attacked for almost a year. During the pregnancy, our relationship had blossomed into the kind of relationship that I'd always hoped it would become. But in this shocking and completely unexpected explosion of rage, those good times were clearly now all over, and the punches just kept coming. I was shouting at Sophie's mother, begging her to stop, but she just kept screaming and attacking me. Even pleading for Sophie's safety had no effect at all, so I just had to take it and try to protect Sophie as best as I could. Now, I can't tell you how many times I was punched in total, but I can tell you that thankfully Sophie suffered no ill harm, either from the choking, which seemed to clear itself during the attack, or from the punches that all missed her. And of course, thankfully, she was too young to remember anything. Of course, my partner had an excuse for the attack. She always had an excuse. On this occasion, it was the stress of the moment, and my fault for the tone of my voice when I'd asked her to hand Sophie over. Now, I'd managed to cope with the abuse up to now, but the stress of an attack whilst holding our small daughter and the shock of it happening again after almost a year tipped me over the edge. At the time of the attack, I worked for NHS Scotland. I was a security officer at the State Hospital, which is Scotland's version of Broadmoor. And it was here that I finally succumbed to the years of emotional, physical, psychological and financial abuse. I suffered a breakdown at work. I collapsed to the floor crying like a child in front of my manager and passing work colleagues. My manager stood over me, desperately searching for the words to calm me down, but he was clearly out of his depth and frozen to the spot. Looking back, I always feel really sorry for him because he just didn't have a clue how to respond. Of course, it wasn't my manager's fault. It was the fault of a management culture that failed to recognise that serious personal issues can and do follow employees into the workplace, often with very serious consequences. So I lay curled up on that busy corridor floor sobbing for around 15 minutes before finally calming down and getting to my feet. My manager placed a hand on my shoulder and asked if I was okay. He then returned to his office and I was left to shuffle off unescorted to my occupational health department. I didn't realise it at the time, but this was actually a turning point. This was the moment that I finally started to take back some control of my life, and I did that by speaking out. I told my occupational health department absolutely everything. Now, opening up to someone else might seem like a very small step to take, but it's the hardest step for many abuse victims, and of course, one of the most important. However, what I didn't know was that my occupational health department were now duty bound to inform social services because a child was involved. I found the idea of them being involved totally terrifying. Would we lose our daughter to the system? Would I as a man be believed? Or, as it happens so many times, would I be automatically treated as the perpetrator? And if so, would I lose contact with my daughter? On top of this, of course, I was deeply concerned about what my partner would do when she found out that I had finally told somebody about what was going on. It's impossible to explain to you today the all-encompassing fear that I felt in that moment. However, it was here, after so many bad experiences with the authorities, that I finally received some support. During my interview with social services, I found that at last someone looked through that fog of gender stereotyping at the broken person sat in front of them. I delivered my story through heavy sobbing, but they were patient, they listened and they took immediate action. My partner was called in and interviewed and eventually admitted the assault. But of course she blamed me and she had a long list of excuses. The truth is that I'd been supporting those excuses for years. You see, I'd learned early on in our relationship that something horrific had happened to her as a child. I had what they now call classic white knight syndrome. And I thought that my love and loyalty to her through everything would eventually prove to her that not all men were there to use her and let her down. I felt that I had to stand by her no matter what, and I told myself this every single time that I took a beating. Of course, the reality was that the more I gave emotionally, financially and physically, the more she took and the worse the abuse got. She told social services that I was an argumentative person, that my tone annoyed her and that we had a fiery relationship. Unbelievably, she also said that she didn't see what had happened as a big deal. Social services told me there were two types of abuser. Those that knew they had an issue and wanted to work to change their behaviour, and those that thought they were not to blame in any way, shape or form, and that it was all their victim's fault. I was told that my abuser was the latter. Despite all of this, I wasn't signposted to any services that could help me, and the police were not informed. I was just advised to pack my bags and to leave her. But they also stated that they knew I wouldn't, as it could take as many as 35 or so serious incidents before someone finally tries to break free. And of course they were right. I stayed, which seems crazy, right? But let me give you just one example of why I did stay. As I'm sure many of you know, domestic abuse is all about control, and abusers will use any means that they can to enforce and maintain that control. So when our daughter was born, my partner refused to name me as the father on the birth certificate. And because we were not married, the government doesn't recognise me as the father, and I have absolutely zero parental rights. Despite this, I have to pay regular maintenance, which of course I'm happy to do. But I think that demonstrates the perfect absurdity of this situation. Not naming me as the father gave her huge control over me because I adore my daughter. If I left, I didn't know if I would ever be able to see her again. There can, of course, be a very long list of reasons why men and women don't leave their abusive partners, including the fear of being murdered. So please, never turn to a victim and say, "Why don't you just leave?" Because it immediately shows a lack of understanding of the situation. Now, I've got a unique view of domestic abuse because decades earlier, as a military police officer, I had attended many domestics in my 13 years of service. And I can honestly say there wasn't one single occasion that I ever considered the man in the room could be a victim. How could I ever consider that a hardened infantry soldier who had served in the Falklands, Iraq or Afghanistan could be a victim of his partner? What could she possibly do to hurt him? And I say she because same-sex relationships were not permitted in the armed forces at the time. Looking back now, I'm embarrassed by my attitude, and I feel guilty for those that may have needed my help and didn't receive it. So maybe it was karma, if you believe in all that, when decades later I found that civilian police officers dealt with me in a very similar fashion. The attitude of police officers that dealt with me on each and every occasion they were called, either by myself or a neighbour, was that I must be the perpetrator, even when there was clear evidence to the contrary. My treatment at the hands of the police took me to the brink of suicide and had such a severe impact on me that it continues to affect my mental health to this day. It was certainly worse than anything that my abuser put me through. Men are the majority victims of suicide, workplace deaths, war, murder and muggings, to name but a few. And while society appears to easily accept these facts, why does society find it so hard to accept that men can be genuine victims of domestic abuse? As I've already stated, last year 786,000 men were recorded victims of domestic abuse, and that is almost 9 full Wembley stadiums. However, is it really surprising that society struggles to deal with the idea of male victims when the same society repeatedly gender stereotypes men as always being the perpetrator and women and girls as the only victims? Just think about it for a moment. If you see a report on domestic abuse in the press, it's almost always headed by a photo of a man with a clenched fist standing over a cowering woman. Our government, councils, the Equality and Human Rights Commission and even the UN are currently running campaigns on domestic abuse where the focus is solely on women and girls. And of course, whilst I fully support all efforts to protect women and girls, campaigns that exclude men perpetuates the belief that men can't be victims to domestic abuse and reinforces the same in the social psyche. This, of course, then trickles down to those in frontline services and can affect the way that you view an individual simply because of their gender. Would you be as willing to dismiss the idea of a male victim if it was your father, your brother or your son? So, I'm here to speak out in an attempt to raise awareness amongst people like you watching today of domestic abuse against men. I want to break down the harmful social gender stereotyping that prevents men from coming forward and as a result leaves 11% of male sufferers selecting suicide as their only way out. A further 41.2% of men suffer with serious mental health issues as a direct result of domestic abuse, and that includes myself. I hope to encourage people like you watching today to change the written and verbal language that you use when you discuss domestic abuse. I believe that we need to remove gender from the conversation and treat domestic abuse for what it is, a victim-perpetrator crime. Now, I want to be clear. This is not an attempt to deny the figures produced by the ONS that show that women are currently the majority victims and men the majority perpetrators. This is an attempt to be inclusive of all victims of this terrible crime and to create conversation, campaigns and legislation that empowers and emboldens all victims to come forward and seek the help that they need. I've been punched in the face so hard that my abuser once broke her hand. I've been denied basic parental rights. I've had my property destroyed. I've been attacked while I slept, being repeatedly punched in the face, and this was a favourite of my abuser. I've been threatened with a knife. I've been repeatedly cheated on, and I've been publicly mocked and humiliated more times than I care to remember. I've been denied access to my own money. I've been deliberately targeted at work by my abuser. I've been told what job I can do and what hours I can and can't work. I've had my life completely controlled to the point where I was even told what food I could and could not eat, forcing me to hide food in the boot of my car. Men do abuse women. Of course they do. But women also abuse women. Men abuse men, and undoubtedly women abuse men. As a male victim reaching out for help, it's a devastating blow to be treated as the aggressor when you're already at rock bottom. I never thought of myself as the type of person who would fall victim to domestic abuse. I always thought that domestic abuse victims were weak-minded people with a low self-esteem. As I've already said, I was a former military policeman of almost 13 years. A security professional that had worked with security teams from 11 different countries and regularly worked hand in hand with the Diplomatic Protection Group in London. I was always extremely confident, both professionally and personally. I've always been an outgoing person and I've never struggled with getting a partner. I was not the kind of person that became a victim to domestic abuse. Of course, I now know that there is no such thing as a typical victim. We're all at risk. I want to ask you, how do you think that domestic abuse affects your workplace community? Perhaps one of your work colleagues is a victim or a perpetrator. I can certainly guarantee that a number of people watching this video today have or are experiencing domestic abuse in some way. For those watching today that are sufferers of domestic abuse, I know that taking the first step is the hardest thing to do. But my message to you is this. Things are not going to get better and your abuser is not going to change. In fact, the abuse is likely to get worse. It's not your fault that you're being abused. You should not feel ashamed to come forward and get the help that you need. Remaining a victim really is not an option. Help is available. I made it, so can you. If you're a line manager, HR manager or policy maker, are you creating a workplace environment that acknowledges and discusses domestic abuse, empowering sufferers to come forward and seek the help that they need, whilst at the same time protecting your business and employees as a whole? Do you have robust domestic abuse policies in place? Do you have robust safety plans in place? And if so, importantly, are they inclusive policies and plans? Or, as unfortunately with many organisations, do they only focus on women and girls, which flies in the face of the Equality Act? Finally, please take a moment when thinking about or dealing with domestic abuse issues to consider the possibility that the man, regardless of his physical stature or job, may be the victim, and please offer him the same help and support that you would a female victim. Thank you so much for joining me today at the ICMI 2020. Enjoy the rest of the videos and have a fantastic day. Take care.